Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, November 29th, 2021. And if you've watched or listened to the show for any amount of time or followed our work at the TAC for a while, you're probably aware that we see the path to liberty through state, local, and individual noncompliance, resistance, and nullification. So today I'm finally, after many months of promising and talking about it and being late, I'm finally talking about the state of the nullification movement and our annual report for 2021, which I've got a printed copy of it right here. State of the Nullification Movement 2021 10th Amendment Center Annual Report. It's not for sale. We don't sell it, but you can download it for free. You don't have to leave your name, your email, nothing. We've just got direct download links for PDF and some ebook formats over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. Now, the first part of this annual report is totally redone. We've had it very similar for a number of years, but we totally redid it. And it's maybe the best thing I think we've ever published. We've got some history, of course, on nullification and interposition going back to 1798, which many people are familiar with. But then we also go back to advice for how to deal with federal overreach, to the ratification debates, the debate over ratification of the Constitution, and even essential principles about resistance to government acts outside of the Constitution from the American Revolution, and some success stories throughout history. That's the first 48 or maybe 50 pages or so. And then there's part two of the book. It's 148 pages. So part two, we track the progress of how these principles are being used and implemented right now before our very eyes. We actually see it happening. I don't think a lot of people were connecting the dots a few years ago, but more and more people are recognizing this. So on this episode, I've got some highlights of how it's being used right now, and I think you're going to find it very interesting. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow the show, all the archives, about 3.5 years worth now. Individual episodes like this one today, I will link to stuff that I'm talking about so you can read and learn more on your own time. This one, primarily, you just want to go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. That's going to have 148 pages of free stuff to download that you can read and learn and then use it to take action in your own area. Use it as examples. You can also find all the different platforms we're on our show homepage. We're on a bunch of live stream mainstream platforms like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Twitch and DLive. And we also live stream at the decentralized, censorship-resistant Odyssey.com. Please follow us there. That is, to me, my favorite video platform right now. We also archive our videos at a number of other places like Ben Swann's Sovereign.media, SOVREN.media. There's Gab TV. There's Minds and Brighteon and BitChute and BitTube and Hyper and all over the place. MeWe sometimes. They have some file size limitations that I just can't seem to get around. And then we have the audio-only podcast edition, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, TuneIn, and a bunch of other ones. And you can even find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. All that and more at the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Just going to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. While we allow people to get notifications on those mainstream platforms, which don't always function as well as we'd like, so they can join us on this live stream. There's Absolute Defiance, 110%. Good to see you. Cheriton Farmer in Missouri. Haji in Oakland County, Michigan. Tim Martin in South Central AZ. Clay Kent, good to see you. Sharon Patriot in Southern California. Shane Lackey, Lawrence Smith. Justin and Eitlander in South Carolina. Joyce Code in Arkansas. Joey. Oh, it's Joey Code. Okay, thank you. Appreciate you saying that. I keep saying every episode, I'm like, okay, how do I say the name? Joey Code. Joey Code. John Hume. That Liberty Gal. Wesley. Jennifer Coop. Jay Armstrong in Alaska. And I appreciate you guys all being here. Thank you so much, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one. So let's get right to it. And as I mentioned at the outset there, we've got that new book. We do actually ship them out. It's very random. Every few years, for people who have annual memberships, you will get a version of the annual State of the Nullification Movement report. So that sometimes gets shipped out. We don't do a lot of printed copies because of the expense, and we really want to get the information out to as many people as possible for free. I've got it pulled up here. Of course, there's the PDF format. That's the easiest. EPUB, that's for Apple and Android. That's really the best ebook version that I've been able to produce. I suck at making Kindle formats, and I really need to be able to spend the extra money to do it. But we do have a Mobi format, .mobi, which you can sideload on some older Kindle devices. I'll just kind of leave that to you guys to figure out how to do conversions if you really want to put it on your Kindle. But that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. Let's go through some of the sections, and I want to highlight some of the pieces. I'm barely scratching the surface because I want to get this in about 30-ish minutes. But we start out with talking about how there is a rightful remedy to deal with federal overreach, and most people have ignored it for generations and generations. Here's how we start out. Vote the bums out. This is literally the first page of writing here. Vote the bums out is the dominant political strategy in the United States. It's absolutely the wrong one, too. So we go through some of the history and the advice of the leading founders and old revolutionaries. For example, Thomas Jefferson, in his draft of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, pointed out that acts outside the Constitution, they're not authorized because the Constitution is supreme. Government doesn't hold sovereignty. Government doesn't hold final authority. It can only do what's authorized under the Constitution, and that Constitution means what it means, even if the government itself has violated it for decades or 100 or 200 years. And he said those acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. And then he says, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. It's not just a good idea. He said using the vote the bums out strategy, this is paraphrasing, it's my modern parlance, it's not Jefferson's eloquent language, but he said changing the people in government is the rightful remedy when they're within the bounds of the Constitution, but just doing policy you don't like. So that's never your option today, because you're never faced with that choice of two people who are within the bounds of the Constitution, and just you choose one who has better policies over the other. So that is never something that should be our first option on the table. And in fact, the first option, according to Jefferson, is a nullification of the act being the rightful remedy. We can also look at the ratification debates. Here, James Iredell, one of the first Associate Justices of the Supreme Court. He was appointed or nominated by George Washington. Here he is in 1788 in North Carolina. He said, there's going to be abuse in every government. How do you deal with it? He says the people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it. He didn't say they will march on D.C. or march on the Capitol and protest and beg that they limit their own power. He didn't say they would go to courts, and he was a judge. He ended up being on the Supreme Court. He didn't say that was the right approach. He didn't say, just choose new people to maybe get rid of the power that they've stolen, because a usurpation of power is a theft of power from the sovereign people of the several states, power not delegated to them. He says the people will resist. And then, of course, we have Madison, James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution. In Federalist 46, he was telling us how to deal with federal acts outside the Constitution or federal acts that are bad policy. For him, he was in some ways a little bit more aggressive on this than Jefferson, in some ways a little bit less aggressive. But he said for either version of that, use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Now, you notice how Jefferson, when he said unauthoritative, void, and no force, he focused on the word void. We're focusing on a whole chapter here on the word void. And I believe Mike Meharry wrote this primarily. He says, notice Jefferson emphatically asserted that when government acts outside of its delegated powers, the action is void. But it didn't come from Jefferson. This was not made up out of nowhere by the founders. This has a long tradition, a long history in the American tradition of resistance and revolution. And he writes this: the concept predates the drafting and ratification of the U.S. Constitution. The American colonists developed this idea, and I'm sure they got it from somewhere else, probably like Algernon Sidney or somebody that they followed and then developed it even further. It's important to understand where these concepts were built. But the American colonists developed this idea in the early days of their resistance to British power, and its currents ultimately ran all the way through the ratification of the Constitution. And I think the most important one to look back at the early days of the Revolution, in fact, John Adams often cited the 1761 speech by James Otis Jr. against the writs of assistance as what he called the beginning of the controversy between the colonists and the British Empire. And there, Otis was talking about a shift in the understanding of sovereignty, final authority in American political thought. And he said, an act against the Constitution, and of course they were talking about an unwritten Constitution, but the principle remains. An act outside or against the Constitution is void. That's exactly how Jefferson put it almost 4 decades later when he was talking about nullifying the hated Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which were signed by the Atlas of Independence, John Adams. What a letdown. Like, started out great and then shifted. And that is really a great example of how power corrupts and how papers don't enforce themselves, because people get in power and they do bad things. So Otis was talking about this shift in sovereignty, because if the government could determine the extent of its own powers, the government was sovereign. The government had final authority over itself. But here he's saying, and this was widely accepted, this is a very important speech, that as soon as they go beyond that Constitution, something else than government is supreme, and that is the supreme law of the land, the Constitution itself. So, but you can't just wave a document at people. And I keep saying words on paper don't enforce themselves year in and year out. And here's how we put it in the report. Declaring something void is one thing. Making it so in practice is something else altogether. So we can talk about things in principle. Oh, well, they shouldn't be doing this. Hey, you guys, you need to stop doing this. This is basically begging. But as Jefferson put it in 1774, a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate. I think I got that right. That was off the top of my head. So if you're going to be a free people, you don't wait for the government to let you be free. You just act free. Here from the report again, you can't just scream, that's void, and hope the government will stop. And I kind of chuckle at that, because that's basically what people do. We've been told for years, every time we point out something as a violation of the Constitution, we get a lot of people, primarily from conservatives, that'll tell us, oh, you should send this article to everyone in Congress. I want to have this email that you sent me. Can you send this out to all the people that were just elected on the right in my state? Things like that, as if they give a damn. These people don't care. Once in a while, maybe 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 100,000 actually care. But the vast majority of them are there to control you. Here, back to the report. You can't wave the Constitution like a red sheet at a bull and expect the government to suddenly cease and desist. Words on paper don't enforce themselves. And as we'll see, they were never expected to either. So we talk about how the old revolutionaries use this principle, this idea of sovereignty, and then acts outside of the Constitution being void as the line in the sand. Well, if they're going beyond what they're authorized to do, the only response is to resist and nullify it. So we've got a great history that actually puts that into practice in 1765. Void in practice, resisting the Stamp Act. It is incredible. We can learn so much about all the different things that they did there. They used non-binding resolutions. They banned enforcement. We even saw a court, for example, declaring something null and void and unenforceable when it came to the Stamp Act. Local sheriffs, non-compliance, resistance, protests, a whole combination of stuff that rendered the Stamp Act null and void in practice and in effect. Murray Rothbard, in his great Conceived in Liberty, referred to it as the people's nullification of the Stamp Act. In this section, you're going to hear about things at work from Patrick Henry, John Dickinson, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, the Loyal Nine, the Sons of Liberty. It's pretty amazing stuff. And as I keep mentioning over and over, and I'll never stop, words on paper do not enforce themselves. And we do have a short section here discussing parchment barriers. James Madison and others referred to even the best Constitution as a mere parchment barrier. You need something other than words on paper to keep the government within the bounds of itself. And here from the report, even as the Constitution was being debated and ratified, there was a general understanding that the document wasn't going to enforce itself. Without some enforcement mechanism, the Constitution is of little use when it comes to limiting the power of the federal government or of any government. You can't just say if we take a couple of general maxims, general understood principles, and put them all together. Power corrupts, power always seeks to expand, and that's all you need. Soon as someone has power, they're going to try to expand. It doesn't matter what you have on paper. That's what it'll always be. So as long as people comply, as John Dickinson put it in response to the Stamp Act, he said, if you comply with the act by using the stamped papers, and this is again a paraphrase, you unnecessarily rivet perpetual chains around your unhappy country. There's no reason for government to back down when they get full compliance. They'll never stop. They don't have any reason to. The reason that they back down, and we see it on cannabis, for example, is because there's been so much resistance in so many states that they don't have the resources to go into every state. They can threaten one for a while, and they have to stop, and they can do another one for a while, and they have to stop. But they've been overwhelmed in their enforcement capacity. I discussed parchment barriers in some detail in a couple of episodes more recently. June 9th, 2021. This I will link to in the show notes. Blame the Constitution? Words on paper don't enforce themselves is the title of that episode. That will be linked to over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That Liberty Gal says, is there any recording of James Otis's speech? I can't find it anywhere to read it. You can actually find it in the collected works of James Otis Jr. on Online Library of Liberty at libertyfund.org. We often link to it in the show notes. There's a link to it as well in the actual State of the Nullification Movement report. If you download the PDF copy, we actually link to all the source documents that we say, well, I hope all of them. There's hundreds of links, and I did my best to include it after I did the layout for the print version in InDesign, which I really had to ramp up my skills at. I think I did a pretty decent job. Now, it's not just the Stamp Act. We actually see how these same principles of resistance and nullification and noncompliance were used in various times throughout American history. For example, against the Fugitive Slave Act, the hated Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and its predecessor, the hated Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Personal liberty laws in the North rendered that null in practice and effect, and southern states even complained about it. South Carolina, for example, listed all the northern states nullifying the acts of Congress or rendering useless any attempt to enforce them. But we also cover efforts to nullify alcohol prohibition. A lot of people think, oh, there was an amendment, and then they realized it didn't work, and then they decided to repeal the amendment. Well, what was that period between putting it in and then realizing that it didn't work? Well, there was a lot of resistance. There was noncompliance. We've learned through studying the history that there was a point in time where 25 states had banned funding for alcohol prohibition enforcement under the Volstead Act. So without state and local enforcement, just like James Madison said, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, the will of that central government became little more than hot air. And we also, of course, cover cannabis prohibition, the granddaddy of the modern nullification movement, from a little bit starting in the 1970s, but all the way through today. Now, what's key here is actually having smart strategy. A lot of people want to think that going after the largest government in the history of the world, the largest military empire the planet has ever seen, is going to be just handled in one election or one lawsuit, or just pass this bill to nullify everything, or throw them all out, or just some kind of silver bullet. But that is just garbage. People who generally expect a silver bullet have never done the activism, because it's very easy to learn how quickly that gets shut down. It is not going to happen. The founders actually told us repeatedly, this is not how you get things done. You do it step by step. You keep grabbing as much as you can for liberty and building on that. You relentlessly keep pushing forward, but you always have your eye on the long-term prize, whether it's going to happen in your lifetime or generations to come. It is our duty, our moral obligation to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty against all hazards. Here, back to the report. Sadly, over the years, the federal government has definitely used this strategy. They have taken hundreds, if not thousands of steps beyond those specifically drawn boundaries. Today, we face arguably the biggest and most powerful government in the history of the world. Now, it can feel overwhelming. But Thomas Jefferson gave us another bit of advice in a 1790 letter, which I know those of you guys who listen to the show regularly have heard me mention over and over and over, but it's so important. To his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay, he said, "The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, that we must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. It takes time to persuade men to do even what is for their own good." And the way you persuade people the best, in my experience at least, is to lead by example. Show people that living a little bit more free doesn't end the world, or that you can do it, or that you're not going to be, putting your neck out, lying in the sand, kind of hill to die on type of thing for every single thing. And you don't want to necessarily do that because you can't help freedom from a prison cell. I mean, maybe some people have been able to, but throughout history. But anyways, back to the report. Meharry puts it this way: "To be blunt, anyone promising a silver bullet is lying to you." Jefferson understood this. Step by step, inch by inch, brick by brick. And I got that phrase, and I've been putting it in our messaging for quite a while after I was very happy to be part of an annual supporter summit with the Mises Institute a few years ago. And that's how Jeff Deist described their work on education. Inch by inch, brick by brick, person by person. That's how we build a strong foundation for the Constitution and liberty. So that takes us to part 2, where we track progress. And if you're looking at the image on the screen here, step by step, we've got to build on each one, just like Jefferson told us, just like John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution. We've got this Latin phrase, which I know I butcher every single time, but thankfully I've got a friend in the comments that's helping me. Concordia res parve crescunt is the Latin phrase that we've got on our membership cards. It means small things grow great by concord. And there, when he was writing that in 1767, he was actually urging non-binding resolutions in support of New York and in support of the colonies against the Townshend Acts. And he even recognized that something that didn't have a concrete effect right now could build into something greater. And certainly the penman of the American Revolution was absolutely correct, because in the next decade, it certainly did build into something greater. So in this next part, we of course discuss how these strategies and principles are being used. And really, it's going to take each of these sections is its own episode. Maybe I should do that one of these years, but not this year. Not this year. So from time to time, I'll cover one particular issue on an episode to see how things are going, give you guys an update, especially during January through May, when we see a lot of state legislative activity happening in response to federal attacks on our liberty. We're going to see plenty of that this year, more maybe than ever. But for example, we start out with cannabis prohibition. And this one I think should be obvious. We've got now 36 states define what every level of the federal government says is illegal by legalizing, at least to some limited purposes, what the federal government says you can't, even in defiance of a Supreme Court opinion in 2005, Gonzalez versus Raich. And then we have 18 states now that have broadened this to recreational. I mean, it's basically flat out resistance, non-compliance, and nullification. We have urged people for years. I started pushing this back 2009, 2010 to the Second Amendment community at the 25th Annual Gun Rights Policy Conference. They held it in San Francisco, of all places, which I think they did just to kind of get some attention and challenge the system there. I thought that was pretty awesome. But I spoke to hundreds of people, and I talked about cannabis prohibition and nullification of it. And people are like, what? This is a gun conference. And then I tied it into, this is the strategy, because we, the people, need to learn how to exercise our rights, whether the federal government gives us permission to or not. And we're starting to see this play out on some other issues like the right to keep and bear arms. We've got a whole section, maybe a dozen pages or so, where we, of course, cover huge, big steps forward for Missouri and Arizona, setting the foundation to nullify federal gun control in practice and effect. We have a narrow but important step forward in Texas against sound suppressors. Now, of course, none of this legislation means anything. We have a section in here before the tracking progress called human action, because it doesn't matter if a state bans enforcement of a federal act. If everyone complies with the federal act, there's nothing nullified. So you need this kind of combination. It really starts out with individuals exercising their rights, recognizing that liberty doesn't come with a permission slip, and acting more freely all the time. And then when the state stops helping the feds, or a locality stops helping the feds, it removes a vast majority of the enforcement mechanism, meaning they can't get it done. So you can't just pass a law on a state level and then have no one risk anything and then expect to be free, because obedience is slavery. We know that old phrase. Anyways, we saw a narrow but important step forward on sound suppressors in Texas, and then smaller foundational steps setting the stage for more in both Montana and in Idaho. But unfortunately, a lot of these politicians on the right on the state level are just absolute garbage. They've grabbed onto something that's very popular, nullifying or rejecting, creating Second Amendment sanctuaries, nullifying federal gun control, and they intentionally pass legislation that absolutely doesn't do that. And then they go out there and say, oh, look what I supported. Vote for me. And these people are absolute garbage. If you're looking at the... Sorry to be so passionate about this, but this is a very important thing to me. Of course, this is the work that I do, and these people are trying to destroy it. So I am not going to let them off the hook. And if you're looking on the screen here, we've got an image that says, beware of politicians. So we cover some of the fake Second Amendment sanctuary laws passed in the state level in the last year. There's actually more of the bad ones than the good ones. We see them in North Dakota, another one in Texas, Arkansas, West Virginia, Oklahoma, and the worst. There's two of them, the worst of the worst, in Tennessee. It's really important to actually keep on top of that. The next section we cover is the police state, and this is a huge chapter. So we are getting now close to double-digit states of opting out of the federal equitable sharing asset forfeiture program. We've seen Maine restrict civil asset forfeiture on a state level this year, and they're also opting out of a vast majority of the federal program. We also saw just this year in 2021 some follow-ups to previous legislation restricting asset forfeiture, expanding on those restrictions in both Arizona and Utah. Then we see two states creating a process to end qualified immunity and even limitations on it in California. Now, qualified immunity is a legal doctrine created out of thin air by the Supreme Court. So even if you like it, it is literally legislating from the bench and forcing it on all the 50 states. So if you like the policy, you don't violate the Constitution and legislate from the bench to enforce it. It's absolute garbage. Then on the police state, we see no-knock warrants unanimously passed in Tennessee, where they've done some pretty awful things, but this is very good. They banned no-knock warrants in Tennessee, really strong restrictions on them in both Connecticut and Washington State, and then we even start covering some local level efforts to nullify the no-knock warrant regime that's been forced on us by the Supreme Court as well on a local level. Next, we cover surveillance. This is something I've talked about for years. Again, back to Maine, they've highly restricted facial recognition surveillance. That's a start. We need to end it completely. Virginia did implement a de facto ban, and a bunch of local jurisdictions on a city and a county level outright banned facial recognition surveillance, facial recognition, even just getting it on a government level. We also cover in this section state and local efforts to restrict surveillance by cell site simulators. They call them stingrays. There's drones, license plate readers, and of course the biggie, taking on the NSA directly. And then I think there's some other sections I'm just going to briefly mention that are so important right now. Of course, sound money. We've got a whole chapter on sound money and the 3 steps that can be taken on a state level to help support sound money, despite the crazy funny money printing that's happening in Washington, D.C. and through the Federal Reserve. We also cover food and health freedom. The more that they try to restrict those things, of course, that affects our life, our liberty, and our happiness. So we cover that as well. And of course, the Defend the Guard, which is a resistance to the empire. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing is more nullification bills introduced, considered, and even passed than at any time in our history at the TAC, and probably any time in the history of the country. Now, mind you, it's all relative. We can grade that on a curve. There's more numerically, but of course, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of more laws and regulations and orders and rules that are on the books that should never have existed in the first place. We are making a lot of progress, but we are really just scratching the surface. And here from the last section of the report, As this report shows, we're making progress and gaining ground for liberty step by step. Back to that Jefferson letter to Charles Clay. And Meharry put it this way, or as Thomas Jefferson put it, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. It's a long, hard road. As Samuel Adams wrote, now is definitely not the time to let up. And that's from his great letter writing as Candidus in the Boston Gazette in 1771, October 14, 1771. That's where the Sons of Liberty published a lot of their messages. And here's how Samuel Adams put it. And this is what we need to be reminded of. No matter how much progress we make today, we're still living under the largest government in the history of the world, so we're scratching the surface. And Adams put it this way. Instead of sitting down satisfied with the efforts we have already made, which is the wish of our enemies, the necessity of the times, more than ever, calls for our utmost circumspection, deliberation, fortitude, and perseverance. So we always have to continually push forward for what is yet to get. Here, back from the last page of the report, we won't win liberty in a day. Not even close. In fact, we're really just getting started. Following Thomas Jefferson's wisdom, we will continue to be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. After all, Jefferson was right. It takes time to persuade men to do even what is for their own good. And again, closing out with brick by brick, person by person, inch by inch, step by step, building a foundation for the Constitution and liberty, whether in our lifetime or in the generations to come. Like absolutely nothing helps us get this work done. Roll up our sleeves every single day in support of the Constitution and liberty more than the financial faith and support of our members. So I wanted to do a quick shout out and a huge thank you, my extreme gratitude to just a handful of people who have joined TAC as members recently. It starts out as just $2 a month if you want to do a monthly. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime membership packages over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you can join us, if you are financially able to do that, I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. A quick thank you to Mark in New Mexico, James in Missouri, Krista in California, Ronald in Maryland, Remy in California, and John in Nevada. Now, if you support the show, you like this episode, you like the work that we're doing, please, of course, don't forget to go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/report to download this annual State of the Nullification Movement report. Share it with as many people as possible. Just put it out there. Write blogs about it, cite it, highlight things, whatever. We just want the information to get to more people because we want people to have the tools that they need to take a stand for the Constitution and for liberty on things that are important to them in their own area. If you support what we're doing, of course, you can smash the like button, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments in the archive on the video platform, subscribing, getting notifications. All that stuff will help trigger the algorithms of the mainstream platforms and tell those platforms to show the program to more people. It helps out a ton. And don't forget that membership program as well. I'm going to take just a quick moment and look over in the live chat and see if there's any questions that I can answer of that Liberty Gal and the James Otis speech. You know, and I'm not 100% sure I got all the links on this PDF. If not, feel free to email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Otherwise, Liberty Fund does have the full collection of James Otis's works. You'll just have to look. That was in 1761. Shane Lackey, Woodrow Wilson's Federal Reserve is null and void on its face. Of course, Thomas Jefferson made the same argument in regards to the first national bank in 1791. As soon as you take a single step beyond the bounds of the Constitution, you've given them a limitless field of power. That was how he argued against that first national bank, saying that it certainly was not authorized. James Madison specifically said, you know, during the Philadelphia Convention, someone, and we know after the fact that that someone was him, proposed the ability of the federal government to have the proposed federal government to have the power to incorporate a bank, to incorporate charters of incorporation, and it was rejected. So the people of the several states, when they were ratifying, didn't even consider the option because it wasn't something that was delegated to the federal government for them to be able to incorporate the bank. Federal Reserve's notes don't enforce themselves. That's pretty awesome. Seeing if the politicians are professional liars, says Tim Martin. Absolutely. They will always scam us. What they care about is getting elected and raising money. They're all grifters, really, when you get down to it. So they are doing stuff that we don't want to, we want to turn our back on their proposals, but we want to be smart about it. Push as far as events will render prudent is how Jefferson wrote to James Madison the day after the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798 passed, November 17th of that year. Clay Kent says, awesome as usual. I really, really appreciate you guys being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you had an amazing Thanksgiving weekend. I actually played a little hooky and got a little bit far behind on some work, but I definitely was so grateful for the time off. I'm grateful for all my friends, my family. I'm grateful for you being here and so grateful for all your support, whether financial or otherwise. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.